As people are just coming into the webinar, feel free to put in your name, where you're joining us from, and your organization in the chat box. My name is Tatiana Torres, and I am with Freedom Network USA. I will be your moderator for today's webinar. We'll just give it a couple more minutes so people can continue to join us, but we're excited to hear from Carlo and share all this information with you all. All right. I'm seeing that kind of come in a little bit. People, the room's filling up, so I think we have a lot of information to get through and share with you all. So we'll just get started. If Alana, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So just some notes on today's presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and the materials such as the PowerPoint will be sent out in a couple of weeks from today, along with a recording that will be available in our resource library. Also, we have a couple of features for today's webinar. If you click on the chat, we want to have engagement and have you ask questions. Actually, no, chat was more for engagement. We also have a Q&A box where you can ask your questions. And if you anything that you would like to ask Carlo or get clarification on, feel free to use the Q&A so we can get have everything in one place. But you have both options available to you, as well as a closed captioning that we are providing for this webinar. And so if you click on the CC, yeah, I think it's enabled, but the CC box, that will get you the transcript for today. Also, let's just go to the next slide, please. Thank you. This presentation is being brought to you by the Freedom Network's Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project, funded by the Office of Victims of Crime. We provide resources, to providers such as yourselves on understanding and connecting housing options for survivors of human trafficking. Through our project, we host bi-monthly webinars, and we also have our resource library, which is constantly updated with fact sheets, toolkits, and practical information. And we can also provide one-on-one assistance to OVC grantees and their partners. All right, so with that, we'll go to the next slide, please. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce your presenter for today, Carlo Ng, who is the Director of Legal Initiatives at the National Alliance for Safe Housing. Just to be mindful of time, I won't be sharing her full bio, but you can find it in the registration for today's email. So Carlo, I'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. It's great to be here today. I'm sure that I've spoken to some of the folks on the webinar today. This is a follow-up to a first webinar that we did on the American Rescue Plan's Emergency Housing Vouchers. And next slide, please. The reason why we're doing this webinar is actually because we're getting so many questions from folks like you about the immigration status requirements related to emergency housing vouchers. And we got enough questions that it really made sense for us to do a separate webinar on this topic. So just to get us started, I'm going to do a quick review of the emergency housing vouchers. Just so you know, we are going to go over a lot of information. It's going to be a lot of information to absorb, especially if a lot of information is new to you. We're going to help you to facilitate some of the learning by providing hypotheticals so that you can apply some of the issues that you learned today. But just know that if you don't get it all right now, it's okay. We're going to be sending the slides out to folks. You'll have the webinar recording, and there's also going to be, we have FAQs, Freedom Network has FAQs and fact sheets related to the emergency housing vouchers that also include questions about immigration status. So there's going to be a lot of content covered among all of those resources. And of course, if you have any kind of follow-up questions, please feel free to contact Freedom Network or myself. We are going to take questions throughout, so if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And my lovely colleagues today are going to help me, identify some of the questions that we want to highlight. So let's go ahead and get started. What is an emergency housing voucher? The American Rescue Plan Act provided $5 billion in emergency housing vouchers, or EHVs, back in March 2021. That funds about 70,000 vouchers across the life of the program. And these vouchers are tenant-based rental assistance, very similar to the Housing Choice Voucher Program or Section 8 vouchers. The emergency housing vouchers are being administered by HUD through public housing agencies or public housing authorities. The folks who get these vouchers, participants, they have to lease up or use these vouchers in the private market. So when they get the housing assistance or the voucher from the public housing authority, they then have to find a unit in the private market where the landlord or owner will take that housing assistance and let them use that assistance to lease up in that unit. And of course, it is a mobile rental subsidy, which means that the housing assistance does move with whoever gets the assistance. So for example, if it's a survivor, a trafficking survivor who needs to move for safety reasons, they can go ahead and move with that assistance, and that should not be a problem. And they can also port that assistance to another jurisdiction. Next slide. If you want more information, please, by all means, go to this website that HUD has that is focused on the emergency housing vouchers. I circled there the link to where people can get more information about the housing authorities that are actually administering these housing vouchers. Not all of the 3,300 public housing authorities across the country have these vouchers. It's a very small subsection that has these vouchers. So please go ahead and take a look to see if in your jurisdiction, in your state, which housing authorities have these vouchers so that you know where to advocate. So if you, or what COCs that you would need to talk to or get in contact with in order to refer survivors to access these vouchers. Next slide. Here are some more resources. That's HUD's website. Just to flag that there is now a certification form for EHV referrals that are for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, as well as human trafficking. This form is in English and in Spanish. So this form is to be used by survivor serving agencies that are going to be doing referrals to housing authorities for survivors who want to apply for the emergency housing vouchers. So that's a fairly new resource. I'm flagging that. There are all these other wonderful resources, EHV resources that Freedom Network has. We had the webinar that we did a month or so ago, the fact sheet, FAQ, and then there's also this guidance document that my organization, as well as the National Network to End Domestic Violence and Violence Free Minnesota provided, created for service providers. So please take a look at that as well. And also HUD has office hours every Tuesdays from 3 to 4 Eastern. That is on HUD's EHV website. I believe someone's going to share a link to get more information about how to access those office hours. Next slide, please. Okay, and so who qualifies for these vouchers? For those who were in part 1 of this webinar, you all know that individuals and families who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, stalking, or human trafficking qualify. Folks who are experiencing homelessness, people who are at risk of experiencing homelessness, as well as folks who are recently homeless, and providing the voucher would prevent the individuals or family from being homeless or from having a high risk of housing instability. And of course, because we are talking to a lot of folks working with survivors, it's really that first category that we are focusing on, although of course there are many survivors who are experiencing homeless or at risk of experiencing homeless or fit into some other category as well. Next slide. Okay, that was a really quick review. Obviously, that was not meant to provide you a full picture of what the emergency housing vouchers are. If you do want information, again, please go back to the HV resources slide. The first webinar gave you sort of a fuller overview of what those vouchers are. We are going to now jump into the immigration status requirements. And again, there's going to be a lot of information. Some of it's going to be a little dense. So if you feel like you're getting a little confused, it's okay. It's a part of learning sort of this sort of very technical area of this intersectional area. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Next slide. Okay, so this is by far one of the most popular questions that I receive, as well as my other colleagues who provide technical assistance at this intersection. There is a lot of concern because of the public charge rule that was issued during the Trump administration. What about public charge? Should survivors who are immigrants be concerned that if they are accessing the emergency housing vouchers or really any HUD assistance, that they will somehow become a public charge or be subject to the public charge test? The answer is no. The 2019 public charge rule that was published during the last administration is no longer in effect. USCIS has confirmed this. If you go to that website, you'll get more information about it, but that rule is no longer in effect. So immigrants, including survivor immigrants, will not be subject to the public charge test for accessing HUD rental assistance, period. And in general, just so you know, the final rule is not in effect. There is still, even before that final rule, there is still another public charge test that is very, very different from what we saw in the 2019 that still exists. But you all should know that survivor immigrants in general are not subjected to that test. So there are a bunch of exemptions to that test, and the exemptions are these folks here that include VAWA self-petitioner, folks who have T&U visas, battered spouse, et cetera, et cetera. All of these folks are not subject to the public charge test. So you should just know that as sort of as a rule of thumb that immigrant survivors generally are not subject to the public charge test. Next slide. I'm going to try to pause in between some of the slides just in case there are some questions. Here's a poll. I want to know from you who is not eligible for, I believe it's EHVs. So please go ahead and pick, do you think it's lawful permanent residents or folks who have green card, refugees, and asylum recipients, folks who are VAWA self-petitioner applicants, U visa applicants or recipients, or bona fide T visas? Who do you think is not eligible for an emergency housing voucher? Okay, you can go ahead and close it. See the results. It is a split. Okay, so people think the largest category is the bona fide T visa, and then second is U visa, and then third is VAWA self-petitioner, and the last is LPR. Okay, let's see what the answer is. Surprise, surprise. The answer is U visas. U visa folks, folks who have applied for U visas, as well as folks who have received a U visa. They are the only folks of the four in those categories. Only U visas are not eligible. And the only way that U visas can be eligible is if they are granted lawful permanent residency or they somehow fit into some of the other eligible categories. It is not bona fide T visas. So we'll learn more about why that is. Basically because the Trafficking Victims Protection Act created an eligibility for folks who have applied for T visas and are considered bona fide T visas. To be eligible for a multitude of federal benefits, and that includes housing benefits. So keep that in mind. U visas are not, bona fide T visas are, VAWA self-petitioners are, and I'll get into that a little bit more as we go along. Next slide. So what are the immigration status requirements for the Emergency Housing Voucher Program? Well, they are the same as they are for the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, right? The Emergency Housing Voucher Program is borrowing a lot of the rules and the laws that apply to the Housing Choice Voucher Program, but there also are a bunch of waivers. So what that means is there has to be at least one member of the household that is either US citizen or national, or they have to be a quote unquote eligible immigrant. An eligible immigrant is defined, that's in the next slide. So I will go over that, that's why it's highlighted here. But just keep that in mind, you have to be US citizen or eligible immigrant. And that US citizen or eligible immigrant can be a minor child. That's something that a lot of folks don't know. So if you have a family, and it's a mixed status family, and the only person in that household who is this US citizen or eligible immigrant is a 3-year-old child, that is okay. What happens is that the assistance will be prorated. So the US citizen or eligible immigrant does not have to be the head of household. So clearly the minor child is not going to be the head of household, but the other adults in the household will sign the lease and the housing assistance documents, because for federal housing programs, you have to have an adult sign documents related to assistance from those programs. You cannot have a minor child doing so. Next slide. So I mentioned mixed status families, right? Mixed status families are households composed of folks who have different kinds of immigration status. Usually it's like some are US citizens and some have maybe some other kind of immigrant status. And so mixed status families, like I said before, can receive prorated voucher assistance. And what will happen is that family members that are not eligible for the assistance, they do not certify and they do not claim eligibility for the voucher assistance. And they can still live in the unit that is assisted by the voucher assistance. But again, the household as a whole will have their assistance prorated to reflect the fact that there are people in that household who do not qualify for the assistance because of their immigration status. Now, practically what that means in real life is that you will see situations where the assistance is prorated such that actually the assistance that the household ends up getting is not enough compared to what the family needs to pay out of pocket. So that housing can still be unaffordable to the family even though they qualify for prorated assistance. Next slide. Okay, so remember before I said who's eligible for emergency housing vouchers based on immigration status? It's US citizens and eligible immigrants. What are eligible immigrants? This is a list of eligible immigrants. These are sort of the most common eligible immigrants that you will find or you will encounter in your practice when you work with survivor immigrants. So there'll be folks with green cards or lawful permanent residents, VAWAS help petitioners, and I'll go over what VAWAS help petitioners in a subsequent slide. Folks who have asylum or have refugee status, parolees, people who have granted withholding from removal or withholding from deportation by the US AG's office, qualified victims of trafficking under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act definition, and again, we'll go over that later. People who've been granted admission for emergent or public interest reasons, folks residing in the US under COFA or Compacts of Free Association with the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. And then immigrants who have been admitted for lawful temporary residence under the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. I would say that in terms of your practice and who you encounter, the first 6 or so categories, so from lawful permanent resident through qualified victims of trafficking, are probably going to be, they're going to fit into one of those categories. There's some exceptions, right? But for the most part, it'll be those first 6 categories. Next slide. This is a lot of information on this slide. I'm not going to go over the entire infographic. I primarily put it here because I thought it was really cool that someone had created an infographic that really showed, for purposes of, serving survivors and other folks, sort of what are like the really common immigration statuses. And so we'll go over T visa, VAWA, and U visa. I wanted to flag asylum here too, because those are for folks that have faced persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. There's also continued presence, which is for victims of victims of a severe form of trafficking who may be potential witnesses in an investigation or prosecution. And generally speaking, federal law enforcement officials request this protection on behalf of the survivors. And then there's also special immigrant juvenile status, or SIJSs, that's for child victims in the US who need the protection of the juvenile court because they've been abused, abandoned, neglected by a parent. Next slide. Okay, so working with immigrant survivors, these 3 categories are probably going to be the most common categories that you'll find in terms of survivors who are looking for some kind of protected immigration status, or they're already in the process of having applied and they're waiting, or they have this status. So VAWA self-petitioners are a spouse or child of a US citizen or a legal permanent resident or parent of an adult US citizen son or daughter. They've suffered battery or extreme cruelty. They have joint residency with the abuser. They have to be of good moral character. And for petitions where there's a marriage involved, so the survivor is a spouse in the relationship, the applicant would have to show that there's a good faith marriage. A U visa applicant is someone who is a victim of a qualifying crime as defined in that immigration law. They've suffered substantial physical or mental abuse as a result of victimization. They have information about the crime that they experienced, and so they either have helped or they're willing to help in an investigation or prosecution of the crime that they were a victim of. And the crime occurred in the US or they violated some US law. And because of that, they are admissible or eligible for a waiver under that immigration law under national or public interest. And then for T visas, they're folks who are victims of severe forms of trafficking. They're physically present in the US because of the trafficking. They've complied with reasonable requests for help in the investigation or prosecution of trafficking, and they would suffer extreme hardship if they were to return to their home country. I just wanted to provide that background because I know that a lot of folks don't necessarily know what these different categories of folks are and how they're different from each other. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful in sort of just giving you bullets for each category. Next slide. Okay, I'll go over this quickly because I'm not sure how many people are going to be working with self-petitioners, but VAWA self-petitioners are eligible immigrants. There's a couple of different sources of legal authority. There was a HUD memo in 2016, the link is there. There was also a related public housing and Indian housing notice that was released in 2017. The link is there. And then more recently, HUD's Housing Choice Voucher Guidebook. And this will be important if you're working with a VAWA self-petitioner and say the Public Housing Authority or the COC is saying, no, VAWA self-petitioners don't, they don't qualify. So I'm sorry. You would want to point to any of these legal authorities, but especially the guidebook to say, no, in your guidebook that talks about the vouchers, you say that VAWA self-petitioners are eligible, and you also provide the documentation that they would need to provide. And so please go to this link. Know that public housing agencies and COCs more likely than not will not know that not only VAWA self-petitions are eligible for vouchers, but also T visas are also eligible. They just do not know. There's a lot of misinformation about the different categories that are and are not eligible that are immigrants. And so it's going to be up to you and others who are working with survivors and know this information to really educate the housing providers and point to a legal authority to show them, no, this is where the authority comes from. You're wrong. Please let my client apply for this voucher. And so the qualification period, what that means is, at what point does a VAWA self-petitioner become eligible for a voucher? For a VAWA self-petitioner, that point starts immediately as soon as they apply for the self-petition. They don't have to have gotten any approvals. They don't have to have actually gotten the status at the moment they apply and until there's a final denial and through any appeals process. So say a VAWA self-petitioner has applied, they get rejected by DHS, and then the VAWA self-petitioner appeals and says, no, I want you to do this again. I want you to review my application and go through this again. Because the survivor has appealed, that person continues to be eligible for the voucher, even though there's been an initial denial, because again, it's through any appeals process and until there's a final decision on that appeals. I hope that makes sense. Next slide. This is just a screenshot of the documentation that HUD has said that VAWA self-petitioners can provide in order to show their immigration eligibility for a voucher. So it's these forms of documentation. I'm not an immigration lawyer, so I'm not going to go through every bullet to explain what these different pieces of documentation is, because I honestly can't explain it to you. But here it is for you. And if you have more questions, I'm happy to reach out to my immigration colleagues to get more detailed information. Next slide. Okay, human trafficking survivor eligibility, like we talked about, trafficking survivors are considered eligible immigrants if they are fleeing trafficking. It's in the EHV notice, they are eligible for the emergency housing vouchers. Let's see, I believe there were some things we wanted to flag related to that, right? So in the emergency housing voucher notice, there is a definition for trafficking that's on page 20, and then there's also an example of a certification form that's on page 58. So that's just eligibility for purposes of getting access to the emergency housing voucher program. A separate question, right, because there's different kinds of eligibility related to accessing the program. The fleeing part is just getting the initial eligibility. One of the next questions is going to be, do they qualify based on their citizenship status? So in order to qualify based on immigration, the trafficking survivor would have to have filed a bona fide application for T visa status, or they have to have been granted continued presence. So we went through what continued presence means, but the definition, I'm just going to read this because it comes from USCIS's website, but what bona fide means A bona fide determination means that USCIS has made a determination that an application for the T status has been initially reviewed, and they determine that the application does not appear to be fraudulent, it is complete and properly filed, includes completed fingerprint and background checks, and presents a prima facie evidence of eligibility for T1 non-immigrant status, including admissibility. So that generally means it looks like they will likely be eligible for that T1 visa status, but it's not a final determination. So that's a bona fide application that someone has reviewed and says, okay, this generally looks like it's headed in the right direction. So let's go ahead and give them bona fide status so that they can access these other benefits. Here are the different documentation options. There's human trafficking survivor self-certification, the HHS certification for adults or letter of eligibility for minors, completed I-914 application for T non-immigrant status, and the I-797 receipt from I-914 bona fide determination or approval notice. And I want to just stop right here to make sure that, see if anyone from Freedom Network has anything to add here.
I think you got it.
Okay, great. So we can move on. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so this was the big surprise, right? When we did our poll, and this is always a surprise. It's not just a surprise to you, it's a surprise to housing authorities, continuums of care, other housing providers, HUD. It's just a surprise. U visas and folks who are special immigrant juveniles, unfortunately, they are not eligible immigrants. They are not considered eligible immigrants for purposes of HUD assistance, including the vouchers. And so as advocates, what I would recommend that you do is see if your client is a U visa or they have SIJS status, to see if they somehow fit into the other eligible immigrant categories that we talked about, that long list that we talked about, including like a victim of trafficking. And if that doesn't work, they don't fit into any of those eligible categories, then you will have to find other forms of housing assistance where they, for example, might not have immigration requirements. And there are quite a few states that have local housing assistance that do not have immigration status requirements. Next slide. Oh, someone asked a question about asylum. We're going to get to that. There's a hypo about that. But let's start with Claire. Okay, so this is how we're going to play this game. I will read the hypo to you, and if folks could just type into the chat box what they think the answer is, that would be really helpful. So here we have Claire, who is an undocumented survivor of human trafficking. She has 2 kids. One is Mike, who's an undocumented teenager, and Tyler is a 6-year-old who was born in the US. Is the family eligible for an emergency housing voucher based on their immigration and survivor status? And explain. Yes, I see a lot of yeses. Tyler is the key. Yes, because of Tyler. Okay. I like your responses. Let's see the answer. Answer is yes. Yay! Good for you. Let's see. But yes, but the low level of payment will make it less than useful. Yes, that's right, Minty. Oh, hey, Minty, good to see your name. Yes, right. The proration might be such that the amount of assistance they get makes it unaffordable for this family to actually live in the unit. So Claire's family is a mixed status family. We all know that. Tyler, who is 6 years old, is eligible for the EHV because he is a US citizen and as a minor, as we already established, can be the only eligible household member. It's a little unclear if Claire has a bona fide application for T status. We know she's a survivor of trafficking, or if she has a continued presence status. The facts don't say that, so we assume not. But as someone who's working with this family, you'd want to ask those kinds of questions. And if she does have any of these statuses, she would be eligible. And then you'd also want to see if Tyler fits into any of the eligible immigrant categories. He might not. He might just not be documented and not have any status. And if not, the family would receive prorated assistance. What happens after the child turns 18 years old? Nothing. They would be a person who's over 18 and in the unit and qualifies for the assistance. And so it would still be a proration situation. If they're getting income, then the income of that person would have to be calculated as part of the proration to figure out the assistance. But other than that, it's generally the same analysis. Next slide, please. Okay, now we have Taylor. Taylor is a U visa holder. They have a 3-year-old child who is a US born citizen. Is the family eligible for an emergency housing voucher? And please explain. Can the minor be an infant? Yes, absolutely. I've had a situation where it was a mom and a newborn, and the newborn qualified and the mom did not. That's a great question. Yes, everyone, a lot of people saying yes. Can I get an explanation, like a why, just a couple of words? Why do you think it's a yes? Or if anyone disagrees, I want to see if anyone disagrees. Okay, child is a 3-year-old born in the US, child is citizen eligible, yes. Okay, okay, let's go ahead and see the answer. Yes, yay. Taylor's family is a mixed status family. Taylor is not eligible, right? We remember U visa holder, U visa applicants not eligible. Her 3-year-old though is a US citizen and is eligible. So the family will receive prorated EHV assistance, right? Excellent. Good job, everyone. Next slide. Here we go. We're going to talk about folks who are asylees and refugees. There's a question about that. Are asylees and refugees eligible? Yes, they are considered eligible immigrants. However, this is a big distinction. They only qualify when they have been granted the status. So unlike VAWA petitioners, and also unlike T visas, they cannot qualify if they're still seeking the asylum or refugee status. They have to have been granted that status by USCIS. It's a really big distinction. And so here are the different forms of documentation that HUD has said they will take to verify that this person has an asylum or refugee status. Again, I'll let you read that. I won't read it. You can read it yourself. But let me know if you have any questions. Next slide. Here is the snapshot from the HUD's Housing Choice Voucher Program Guidebook that will lead you to the documentation information for asylees and refugees. It's the same information that I put in the prior slide, but I wanted you to see it. So again, if you are encountering housing providers that have no idea what you're talking about, that, oh, asylees, they can get access and we have to accept documentation. Well, what does that look like? Here you have that information. Next. Okay, we're going to transition into Social Security numbers, and Social Security numbers is so interrelated with folks' immigration status, and it is something that HUD requires in order to be eligible for HUD assistance. So Social Security numbers, what HUD has said is that every member of an applicant household must disclose their Social Security numbers in order to be eligible for the assistance. That is only true if you have claimed eligibility for the assistance and you want to receive assistance as someone who is eligible. If you do that, then you have to provide a Social Security number. There are some exceptions for folk, like children who are just born and children under 6, but generally speaking, that's the rule of thumb. However, if you're in a mixed status family and you are a family member that does not have the required immigration status and you're not claiming eligibility, you do not have to provide a Social Security number or information about your immigration status. So those are really, really key facts to remember because, again, the housing providers might get this wrong. So if they're saying, we have encountered housing authorities that have information in their written material saying everyone in the family must provide a Social Security number in order for the family to be eligible. That is not true if we're dealing with a mixed status family and the assistance is going to be prorated. So if you see that information or you're working with a family that has encountering some of those barriers, again, it's an opportunity to educate and point to the legal authority that supports your position and obviously advocate for your client. Next slide, please. What are the Social Security number requirements? Okay, so to verify Social Security numbers, an applicant has to produce either an original Social Security number card, an original SSA or Social Security Administration issued document containing the applicant's name and SSN, or an original document issued by a federal, state, or local government agency containing the applicant's name and Social Security number. The housing provider then transmits the applicant's name, the Social Security number, and the date of birth to HUD, and then HUD validates the Social Security number against the Social Security Administration's database. There's a question here about, will these types of visas be on the SAVE reports that PHAs have access to? It will depend. You know, it should because SAVE, it's DHS's database SAVE. But what happens is sometimes the information reported in SAVE about folks is not accurate or up to date. And so that's where you have discrepancies. We've had issues with that with VAWA petitioners because of the way that DHS is labeling VAWA petitioners. It looks like there's confusion about the way it's labeled, if they have the status or if they've been denied. And so you have to be really sort of careful about how you read SAVE. And we've talked to DHS about that. So I would say generally yes, but there have been instances where we've had issues with SAVE. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'll go over this quickly. VAWA self-petitioners generally as a category will not have work Social Security numbers. So Social Security numbers that allow you to be employed and work. And so what you'll need to do as an advocate is you'll need to work with them and the Housing Authority as well as the Social Security Administration to request a non-work Social Security number, which is a Social Security number that you need in order to access benefits, basically. And so the National Immigration Women's Advocacy Project, they have a tool to help advocates kind of walk them through to explain like what you need to do, what the issue is. There's also a sample letter that we have provided. The letter is also here. There's an example from the state of Washington, where essentially you need a letter from the Public Housing Authority on their letterhead that requests the Social Security Administration to provide a non-work Social Security number so that the VAWA self-petitioner can get access to the federal housing assistance. And basically the PHA, the Housing Authority, would be saying this person basically qualifies, but for the fact that they don't have a Social Security number. And as soon as you can give us that non-work Social Security number, they can get access to the program. Next slide. Okay, really, really important. We've been talking a lot about how the Housing Choice Voucher Program, what are those requirements, how those requirements overlay into the Emergency Housing Voucher Program, because again, right, the Emergency Housing Voucher Program is borrowing a lot from the Section 8 program and how that is run. But there are major waivers and major exceptions. So one of the major exceptions and waivers is this grace period that folks have to provide the verification and documentation related to citizenship, immigration status, and Social Security numbers. So normally, if you were to apply for Section 8 and you got to the top of the wait list and you're going through the eligibility process and they said, great, like you're admitted, but we need now to look to get the documentation to show that you're an eligible immigrant, you would need to provide it right away. Normally in the Section 8 program, we'd have to provide it right away, right up front. And if you cannot, you would not be eligible for the program. You'd have to wait and they'd have to move on further down their wait list. For the emergency housing vouchers, there's been a huge waiver. If you do not have the documentation for your immigration status or for your Social Security number, that is okay. You have up to 180 days from admission to provide that information. So up to 6 months to provide that information. And there's also some additional information here where public housing authorities can provide extensions to the 180 days if they have evidence that the family or there's confirmation from the continuum of care or other agency that the family has really, really tried to get that verification or documentation, and they just haven't been able to do that yet. Okay, next slide. All right, I hope I'm not going too fast, but here we have Kim. Again, we're going to do the same thing, so I'll read the hypothetical and please go ahead and type in your answers. So Kim has recently applied for a VAWA self-petition, and she does not have a Social Security number. She would like to apply for an emergency housing voucher by herself. Is she eligible? What do you think? And please explain. Okay, so one person has said no. One person is asking if she's gotten her prima facie determination. Yes, but the PHA could request the non-working Social Security number for her to complete the process. Okay, no, she cannot because she does not have a Social Security and does not have a legal status yet. Okay. Okay, yes, she would get the grace period to provide further information. No, okay, so we're kind of, there's a mixed bag here. There's a mixed bag. Okay, so this is good. This is good. This means that we are learning and we are, trying to really absorb a lot of this really technical information today. Okay, so let's take a look at the answer. The answer is yes. She just applied for the VAWA self-petition. And the VAWA self-petitioner category is very different from the other categories because from the moment that a survivor applies, they are eligible. They don't actually need a prima facie determination in order to be eligible for a voucher. They are eligible as soon as they apply and until the survivor has been denied through any appeals process. Now, she does not have a Social Security number at admission, right? She just doesn't. And normally in the Section 8 program, that would mean that she is not eligible. However, we are not in normal Section 8 land, right? We are in the Emergency Housing Voucher land where we just learned that there's a big waiver. And so for people who are eligible in every other category, except for the fact that they don't have a Social Security number, they have up to 180 days, which is subject to an extension from the Housing Authority, but up to 180 days from admission to provide documentation related to their Social Security number. So she can work with the public housing agency to get a non-work Social Security number and at the same time apply for a work Social Security number. There's a little bit of a delay in terms of people getting their work Social Security number. People are saying it's taking 6 months or longer than 6 months for survivors to get them. So in the meantime, we're recommending that survivors also try to pursue a non-work Social Security number. Okay, next slide. All right, here's our last hypothetical. It involves Lena and her 2 children who are from Cambodia. They are seeking political asylum. Lena has a Social Security number and a work permit. Is the family eligible for an emergency housing voucher? Can tell this is a little tricky. People are not sure. It's okay. We're all learning here. We got to make mistakes so that we can learn. Okay, no, not until she's granted. No, because they have to be granted. Okay, it seems like it's unanimous. All right, so let's take a look at what the answer is. You're right. I totally thought I was going to trick you. You were not tricked. Good for you. The answer is no. Like you said, the family is not eligible for an emergency housing voucher because they are only seeking political asylum. They have not been granted asylum status, which is what they need in order to be eligible. It does not matter that Lena has a Social Security number and a work permit. And this was actually a real situation. It was a real situation involving a family where very similar facts. The family was seeking, then they had the number and the work permit, and it doesn't matter. They need to be granted asylum status. Okay, next slide. Okay, so tips for advocates. Like I've said throughout the presentation, please do not assume that the housing providers and the entities that are providing the housing assistance or involved in the housing assistance know what the proper immigration status requirements are. My experience has been overwhelmingly that they do not, and that includes when myself and my colleagues do trainings for housing authorities and other folks on these exact same issues, and routinely they get them wrong and they ask questions like, oh, that's not true. Oh, okay, that is true. Okay. And especially for folks who are applying for T visas or trafficking survivors, they will not know. They more likely than not won't know, and they will assume that these categories of folks are not eligible, and that is not true. So yeah, public housing agencies get that wrong routinely, including in their written policy documents. I provided that example earlier of having seen documents that said things that were not correct. So if something doesn't sound right to you, please definitely push back, provide the right information to them to support your position and to advocate for your client. Next slide. Okay, we're at the end and we have time to spare. Oh my gosh, I can't believe we actually got through all the slides. I'm so excited. Okay, so we have time for Q&A.
Perfect. So the first question, and I asked Rosa to just clarify a little bit. We had a question regarding visa length validity, and she asked if S visas and U visas were 3 years and T valid for 4 years. Is that correct? Can you?
Oh, I don't know. I have no
Okay.
idea. That's I'm not an immigration lawyer. I don't know if folks here know about T, but I don't know how long they last. I'm sorry.
Okay. That is okay. We definitely have a lot more questions that came in through registration. So let's see how we can get those addressed. So what is the EHV process like for people recently released from detention centers?
It would be the same as for anybody else. So they would have to locate the continuum of care. I would recommend the first step be the continuum of care that is working with the housing authority that has the emergency housing vouchers. So they would apply through the continuum of care. If there are other referral agencies, great, but the first point of contact is probably the continuum of care. And then the continuum of care is going to do that threshold eligibility scan of, okay, do you fit into one of those 4 categories? Are you part of the fleeing category? Are you facing homelessness, et cetera, et cetera? And if they qualify based on that threshold, then the continuum of care or other referral partners will either help them put together an application package. A lot of the COCs are helping the actual applicants put together all the documentation necessary and help them complete forms to then send to the housing authorities. So that'll generally be the process in terms of accessing, how to contact the COCs. I think starting with websites is helpful. Like if the COC has a website or if the housing authority has a website, sometimes all this information is new, so it's sort of slowly coming out, but I would check websites. I would call folks also to see like if there's a portal that they need to interface in order to apply.
Thank you, Carlo. The next question is, do these requirements add any additional barriers to clients that have limited access to technology or other services? And you just kind of talked about how the COCs are really trying to help coordinate this for folks. So if you have anything else to add to that question.
Yeah, I mean, different localities are doing it differently. There's quite a bit of reliance on technology. So I've seen some virtual portals, right? Like online portals, etc. As part of that, there's also an alternative to just call folks so that they can apply that way. Like we've raised some issues that survivors may have in terms of confidentiality and privacy, feeling like, I don't want to just put my information online and not know how that's being shared and with whom. And so they're more comfortable picking up the phone and talking to someone one-on-one and providing the information that way, or even going in person. So we've seen different alternatives. And also just not everyone has access to the internet. So I think there are that folks understand that, and there are different ways to apply.
Thank you. We also had another question regarding how long-term residential programs serving survivors benefit from these housing vouchers.
Long-term residential programs, what does that mean? You mean like supportive programs?
Yeah, I think just programs that are supporting like any perhaps just transitional housing programs, things that maybe are like kind of supporting survivors in that direction.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing to possibly think about is the option of actually a nonprofit having a master lease and then contracting with the survivor as the tenant. That's been an option that's actually been shared by HUD and other TA providers as an option, not just not necessarily with this pot of money, because the voucher does have to go to the survivor directly, but as part of the other like ERA funding, their emergency rental assistance funding that Treasury is putting out, the like $46 billion, that is something to think about, is like not thinking about these pots as in their individual silos, but like kind of braiding and leveraging. Those are sort of the new buzzwords, so that survivors that have sort of a range of different needs can look at these different options together and see how folks can partner essentially, so that the survivor and other folks can access these funds to make them whole.
Great, and thank you for addressing that sublease, because we had a question that came in about that as far as like if subleases can qualify. So there's just other ways of supporting.
Yeah, we can talk more about it. I mean, I think this is sort of an emerging topic about how folks can use the emergency rental assistance fund. So not these vouchers, but this other pot of money in a flexible way so that you can enter into the arrangements that you're talking about, Tatiana, where master leases, subleases, so that, you know, survivors can access these as easily as possible. So we can talk about that.
Well, we have other questions that just came in. Is there a HUD-created checklist or hierarchy of verifications that public housing authorities can use to check eligible status for emergency housing vouchers? She knows that SAVE is the first and highest verification, but that there's like DHS documents. So what are like acceptable documentations for this?
Yeah, I definitely take a look at that link to the Housing Choice Voucher Guidebook. That snapshot, the screenshot that I provided in the slides, that actually gives you the full list that I found, at least in the guidebook, and it's not exhaustive. Please know that it is not exhaustive, because when I looked at the list, I was happy that I saw documentation related to VAWA self-petitioners, which is the first time they had even officially kind of acknowledged in the guidebook that VAWA self-petitioners are eligible. But I did not see any documentation related to trafficking survivors or folks who have applied for T visas. So please don't think that that list is by any means exhaustive. And it's going to take some advocacy, quite frankly, with the housing authorities to say, look, this is verification that DHS accepts. So if it's good enough for DHS, it has to be good enough for you. But you're not necessarily going to get that guidance from HUD on paper. You might have to actually email your local HUD office to get confirmation about that.
Gotcha. Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions if anyone would like to just pop them in the Q&A, or there's actually, I have some more here. Do you know if there's a system set up to interface with landlords to sensitize them on this issue? And I'm assuming the issue would be HAVs.
Yeah, that's a really good question. HUD has been putting out a bunch of webinars and resources for landlords around the vouchers landlords, but also housing authorities specifically, as well as COCs, to educate them about the vouchers, because it is such a new program that is similar to the Section 8 program, but also is massively different because of all the different waivers to make the program more accessible. So the HUD webinars and resources are all online. Does that mean that there's still a ton of questions? Yes, there's still many, many questions that housing providers have, we have, potential tenants have. So there is an effort to educate housing providers, but there's still many questions that need to be answered.
Great. Well, I think I'm not seeing any other questions come through, and one just came through. If clients have temporary residency with an I-797, can they still qualify? Sometimes I have clients who have already started their immigration process prior to coming into shelter, so it's not VAWA, U visa, or T visa.
I have to check what an I-797 is. If we wouldn't mind going back to the eligible immigrant slide, that would be great. Basically, the person would have to fit into one of those categories of eligible immigrants. I don't know what an I-797 is, but if that person doesn't have the status that's listed here, then they're not going to qualify. Unfortunately, this is like an exhaustive list. So folks who are still waiting, I can go ahead and actually Google I-797 and try to answer the question.
So there's another question that actually came in. What happens if the individual has a social security number but lost her green card and is reapplying?
Has a social security, so that means they're a lawful permanent resident, right? So they qualify as an eligible immigrant, and they have the social security number, so that's helpful. But they are going to have to provide documentation related to the lawful permanent residency. So usually it's the actual card itself, but if they've lost it, and I'm trying to figure out, sorry, you could go to the screenshot that had that like blue, with all the documentation options too, because then we'll have sort of so for a lawful permanent, so this is from the guidebook, right? HUD's guidebook saying these are the documentation that have to be provided that are unexpired. So an acceptable form is form 1551 or the permanent resident card. It looks like
see the I-797 notice on there.
Is it on there?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
in the box in the red box.
And I,
So
this,
it's notice of action, but it depends on.
yeah, it's so, the I-797 form has to say, it has to say notice of action, and it has to say whether or not there's been like a prima facie determination or approval of self-petition, but also just a completed I-360 valid self-petition or completed I-30 that there's been a family-based visa petition could also be just fine. So you don't even need an I-797 if you haven't received one yet. I'm not sure if that's helpful because sometimes folks just have the family-based visa petition or a copy of it, and they might not actually have the 797.
Yeah, her client has a temporary residency with I-797. So
okay, so it sounds like maybe that, you know, if it fits this, the notice of action, then that should be good enough.
All right. Well, Carlo, I think I not seeing anything else. Okay, thank you. So I think we are okay to end it here. We just want to thank everybody so much for your participation. Thank you, Carlo, for you know, being willing to come back and kind of dive in through this really sometimes just this messy situation, but really helpful for the survivors that are hopefully getting connected to the services. So just to wrap up, feel free to contact us if you have any other questions. Visit our resource library, and like we mentioned, we will be sending out this webinar along with the PowerPoint and any other materials within 2 weeks. So again, just thank you so much. Thank you, Carlo, and have a good rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you so much, everybody. See you later. Bye.